It was a bright and sunny morning in Atlanta, Georgia. The airport was buzzing with activity as travelers made their way through the terminals, eager to catch their flights. Among them was Todd Whitaker, a businessman in his mid-40s, who was on a routine trip to Seattle. He had his briefcase in hand, a look of determination on his face, and his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for a quiet spot to wait for his boarding call. As the flight was called for boarding, Todd made his way to the gate, where he joined the line with a number of other passengers. His mind was already drifting to the meetings and presentations he would have to attend in Seattle, the deadlines that were quickly approaching, and the general stresses that came with his high-pressure job. He wasn't particularly excited about the flight. It was just another part of his day-to-day routine. As the passengers slowly filed onto the plane, Todd found his assigned seat, 7B, near the window. He settled into his seat, stowed his briefcase overhead, and began to relax. It wasn't long before the sounds of other passengers finding their seats filled the cabin. There was a lot of chattering, the usual hustle and bustle before takeoff. In the row next to Todd sat Ebony and her family. Ebony, a young woman in her 30s, was traveling with her husband, 2 kids, and her elderly mother. They were on their way to Seattle to visit family. Ebony was a lively woman, always laughing, chatting with her kids, and creating a warm atmosphere. As they got settled, her kids were playfully bantering, and her mother was busy adjusting her seatbelt. Unfortunately, Todd wasn't in the mood for loud conversations. He frowned as he noticed Ebony laughing with her children, the noise traveling through the cabin. He looked out the window, hoping the sounds would fade, but they didn't. Instead, they grew louder. He could hear Ebony's voice clearly, animated and full of energy, as she was telling her kids about something funny she had seen in the news. Todd shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He just wanted peace and quiet. He wasn't the type of person who enjoyed loud conversations, especially on a flight. His irritation began to grow. He muttered under his breath, not wanting to get involved in a confrontation, but feeling increasingly annoyed by the disruption to his quiet time. The noise continued. Ebony, unaware of the growing tension, was engaged in a lively conversation with her husband. Her kids were laughing about something, and the air seemed filled with the sound of their happiness. But to Todd, it felt like nothing short of an intrusion. He shifted again in his seat, tapping his fingers on the armrest, trying to focus on the magazine in front of him. But the noise wouldn't stop. Minutes passed, and Todd's discomfort only increased. He began to give the family irritated glances, hoping they would notice and tone it down. But Ebony and her family seemed oblivious. The more Todd tried to ignore them, the more his frustration built. Finally, unable to keep it in any longer, he leaned over and muttered loudly enough for Ebony to hear, "Could you please keep it down? Some of us are trying to get some rest." Ebony paused mid-laugh, her expression a mix of surprise and confusion. She looked at Todd for a moment before giving him a polite but puzzled smile. "We're just talking to our kids," she said, her tone warm, unaware of how much Todd's irritation had boiled over. Todd, however, wasn't satisfied. He wasn't accustomed to being disturbed, especially not during a flight where he was hoping to relax and get some peace. His temper flared as he gritted his teeth and leaned back in his seat, muttering under his breath about how people these days didn't have any consideration for others. The more he stewed in his frustration, the more agitated he became. It wasn't long before Ebony's laughter returned, this time a bit louder as she joked with her children about something else. Todd's face reddened. He glanced around the cabin, and it seemed like no one else was paying attention to the noise. It felt like his irritation was the only thing that mattered. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Todd tried his best to close his eyes and forget about the noise. But the constant chatter, the laughter, the sound of children playing, made it impossible. His patience was wearing thin, and he began to feel trapped. The flight had barely begun, and already, he was looking forward to it ending. But what Todd didn't realize was that Ebony, for all her liveliness and enthusiasm, was a kind-hearted woman who simply loved life and loved sharing that joy with others. Her laughter was a reflection of her spirit. She had no idea that her cheerful energy was slowly wearing away at Todd's patience. The stage was set. The tension in the air was palpable. and the flight had only just begun. The minutes ticked by, each one adding to the mounting discomfort Todd felt in his seat. The low hum of the aircraft's engines seemed to blend into the background as his mind fixated on the noise emanating from the row beside him. Ebony, oblivious to Todd's growing frustration, continued her animated conversation with her children, laughing loudly as she shared a funny story from her childhood. Her energy seemed boundless, her every word filled with excitement, drawing her children into her joy. For Todd, however, it was as if every laugh, every giggle from the kids, and every word spoken was a sharp jab at his peace of mind. The minutes dragged on, and with each passing second, his patience wore thinner. He tried to push the irritation aside, taking deep breaths and staring out the window. The city below was a blur as the plane soared higher into the sky. And yet, the sounds from Ebony's family filled the cabin, louder than ever. Todd's hands gripped the armrest as if trying to hold on to his last remaining semblance of calm. He shut his eyes briefly, praying for some peace, but the noise wouldn't stop. It was like a relentless wave crashing against the shore, pulling him deeper into frustration with every passing moment. He could hear the kids shouting playfully, their voices rising above the hum of the plane. He could hear Ebony's laugh echoing, infectious and impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the noise anymore. It was the feeling of helplessness, the inability to escape it. Todd's mind began to race, replaying moments of his day, all of which had led him to this point. His early morning meeting with his team had been stressful, filled with last-minute changes to the presentation. The client he had been working with had been demanding, pushing for immediate answers, even though they knew the answers would take time. The flight was supposed to be a break, a brief respite from the constant pressure, a time to mentally recharge before the next round of meetings. But instead, the plane became a prison, the constant sound of laughter and chatter his only companion. Todd tried to focus on the tasks he would face in Seattle, the to-do list in his mind growing longer with every minute. He had to be sharp, organized, and focused. He couldn't afford distractions. And yet, here he was, trapped in a cacophony of voices that he couldn't escape. Beside him, Ebony's kids were now arguing over something trivial: who had the better seat, who got to control the window shade, and who would sit next to Mom. The constant back and forth seemed to pierce through Todd's calm, each exchange a reminder of how little control he had over his own environment. The noise was out of his hands, and that was the most frustrating part. Todd shifted again in his seat, tapping his fingers on the armrest, wishing the conversation would die down. He could feel his heart rate increase, a knot tightening in his chest. He glanced over at the flight attendant who was calmly walking down the aisle, a smile on her face as she checked in with passengers. Todd envied her composure. Was she unaware of the chaos around her? Or did she, like everyone else, have a tolerance for noise that he simply couldn't comprehend? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden burst of laughter from Ebony's family. Her husband joined in, and the whole row seemed to ripple with joy. They were discussing something personal, a memory from a trip they had taken years ago. And in that moment, Ebony's voice soared above the others, loud and clear. Todd's frustration boiled over. He tried to close his eyes again, hoping the warmth of the sun outside would help him forget the noise. But it didn't work. It only seemed to intensify the feeling of being trapped. His mind raced. Why couldn't they just quiet down? Why did they have to be so loud? It wasn't as if the plane was full of people who could have benefited from a little peace and quiet. He wasn't asking for complete silence, just a moment of reprieve, a break from the barrage of sound that seemed to invade every corner of the cabin. His eyes flicked back to the row beside him. Ebony's family was still laughing, and now her mother was chiming in with a joke of her own. Todd's face flushed with annoyance. He gritted his teeth, staring down at his lap, his fists clenched, trying to contain the anger that was beginning to rise within him. Why was he so affected by this? After all, he had dealt with much bigger challenges before. There were countless business trips where things hadn't gone according to plan, or stressful meetings where he had to manage difficult clients. He had faced far more daunting situations. And yet, here he was, sitting in the comfort of an airplane, unable to deal with a little noise. His frustration was no longer just about the sound. It was about his inability to control the situation. Todd had always prided himself on being able to manage his environment, his work, and his life with precision. But here, on this plane, he was powerless. And that feeling of powerlessness, the knowledge that there was nothing he could do to change the situation, was unbearable. It wasn't long before his thoughts began to spiral. What if this noise continued throughout the entire flight? What if the situation didn't improve? What if, by the time they landed in Seattle, he was so frazzled that he couldn't perform at his best? The more he thought about it, the worse it seemed. He looked around the cabin again, hoping to find someone else who might share his frustration. But everyone seemed content. Some were reading books or magazines. Others had headphones in, lost in their own worlds. No one else seemed to be bothered by the noise. It was just him, and the realization hit him harder than anything else. This discomfort, this growing sense of frustration, was his own battle to fight. Todd took another deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the noise just wouldn't stop. It was like an insistent buzz that filled his ears, louder than the hum of the engines, louder than his own thoughts. And with each passing moment, he could feel himself becoming more agitated, more aware of the frustration building inside him. As the plane continued its ascent, Todd's discomfort reached its peak. He had reached the tipping point. He couldn't take it anymore. The decision was made in a split second. He leaned forward, taking a deep breath before turning his head toward Ebony and her family. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Could you please keep it down? Some of us are trying to rest." Ebony paused mid-sentence, her eyes locking with Todd's. For a moment, there was a silence, a brief interlude where time seemed to stand still. And then, just as quickly, the tension between them snapped. The moment Todd spoke, everything in the cabin seemed to freeze for just a beat. Ebony's bright smile faltered, and for a second, there was an eerie silence between them. The laughter of her children, which had filled the air so freely just moments before, seemed to die down, replaced by the faintest murmur of disbelief. For Todd, the words had left his mouth before he could stop them, and now there was no turning back. Ebony's eyes widened slightly, and her initial shock was quickly masked by a flicker of indignation. She had been talking, caught up in her own little world of joy, sharing stories with her children as families often do on long flights. To her, this was a time to relax, to make memories, not to be scolded by a stranger for something she thought was harmless. Her smile, which had previously been so warm, now seemed somewhat strained. "What did you say?" she asked. Her voice, though polite, carried an undercurrent of defensiveness. She leaned slightly forward, making eye contact with Todd. The other passengers in the row were now looking over as well, their gazes flicking from Todd to Ebony, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The hum of the airplane's engines filled the space once again, but it was no longer the dominant sound. Instead, an uncomfortable tension seemed to settle over the cabin. Todd could feel the weight of every eye on him, and it made his already heightened anxiety worsen. The spotlights of attention, once again, felt suffocating. "I just thought maybe you could lower the volume a little," Todd said, forcing the words out. His voice felt hoarse, as if the very act of asking for some peace had drained him. He could feel the sweat beginning to form on his palms, his body betraying the calm demeanor he was desperately trying to maintain. Ebony paused, her lips tight. Her children, sensing the shift in mood, were now looking at her, their faces filled with confusion. They had been laughing, playing, enjoying their time without a care in the world. And now, it seemed, their fun had been interrupted by an angry stranger. A silent agreement passed between them. They would go silent. For now, they didn't understand what was happening, but they could sense something in the air. "What's your problem?" Ebony's husband, who had been sitting across from them, finally spoke. His voice, like Ebony's, was cordial at first, but there was no mistaking the edge it carried. Todd felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The moment had escalated from a mild inconvenience to a full-on confrontation, and now, the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. "I'm sorry if I've offended you," Todd said, his voice quieter now. "I just need a bit of quiet. I've had a long day." The words left his mouth, but they didn't sound sincere even to his own ears. They felt weak, as if they couldn't fully explain the frustration he had been bottling up for hours, days, even weeks. He had tried to keep his cool, to maintain his composure, but now that the dam had broken, everything came rushing out in a disjointed mess. Ebony's husband leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He was trying to assess the situation, probably wondering whether it was worth escalating further or whether he should simply ignore the stranger's request. But Todd's words had struck a nerve, and he was no longer interested in pretending that nothing had happened. "What's your deal? Are you really going to make a big deal out of this?" The words were biting, harsh in their delivery. It was clear that Ebony's husband didn't understand why Todd was so upset, and he was growing increasingly frustrated with the entire situation. Todd's face flushed a deeper shade of red. He could feel his blood begin to boil, but he fought to keep his emotions in check. This wasn't supposed to happen. He didn't want this confrontation. All he had asked for was a little peace. But now it seemed that his attempt to gain a moment of quiet had turned into a full-blown standoff. The other passengers were watching intently now, some trying to discreetly glance over their magazines or pretend they hadn't noticed. But Todd could see the tension in the room. He could feel their eyes on him, like silent judges weighing his actions. What had started as a simple request was now a spectacle, a scene unfolding in real time. The pressure of it all weighed heavily on his shoulders, and he couldn't help but feel more and more cornered with each passing second. "I'm just asking for a little respect," Todd said, the words escaping before he could stop them. His voice, still shaky, cracked slightly as he spoke, betraying the emotions he had been trying to suppress. "We're all on this plane together. Just a little quiet. That's all." Ebony's husband shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed. "Respect?" he repeated incredulously, his voice rising slightly. "You think we're being disrespectful?" His tone now had an unmistakable edge of anger, and the tension in the cabin ratcheted up another notch. For a moment, there was only silence, and it felt as if the entire plane had gone still, each passenger holding their breath, waiting for the next word, the next action, the next escalation. Todd could feel the sweat pooling in his palms, the heat creeping up his neck. The pressure in his chest was almost unbearable now, as though the weight of the world had settled on him. The laughter and chatter of Ebony's family seemed distant now, but their proximity made it impossible for Todd to escape the confrontation he had started. "What's the matter with you?" Ebony's husband asked, his voice rising. "You think you're the only one on this plane? You think you can control how everyone behaves just because you want a little quiet?" Todd felt his heart rate spike, his breath becoming shallow. He had to do something, anything, to defuse the situation. But the more he tried to hold on to his composure, the more it slipped away from him. Every word out of Ebony's husband's mouth made the situation worse, and every moment of silence that followed felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Todd began, but his voice faltered. He didn't know what to say anymore. He had no answer. He didn't know how to make them understand the frustration, the anxiety, the pressure that had built up inside him. The words wouldn't come. A flight attendant approached at that moment, her face calm but cautious. She had heard the commotion, and though she had no idea what had been said, it was clear that something was happening. The last thing the crew wanted was a scene that could escalate further, especially in a confined space like an airplane. "Is everything all right here?" the attendant asked, her voice even and professional, though her eyes flickered nervously between Todd and the family. "Everything's fine," Ebony's husband said quickly, forcing a smile. "We're just having a little disagreement. That's all." The attendant nodded, though her concern was palpable. She lingered for a moment, scanning the cabin, before moving on. But the damage had already been done. The tension was now thicker than ever, the atmosphere thick with animosity. Todd's entire body was on edge, his nerves fraying with every passing second. The plane's steady hum seemed to mock him now, the noise of the engines nothing compared to the chaos in his mind. Todd looked around, realizing that the other passengers were not as disinterested as he had hoped. Some were staring outright, while others tried to pretend that they weren't listening. No one was looking at Ebony or her family, but all eyes were now on Todd. He had made the mistake of engaging. He had made the choice to speak up. And now, there was no turning back. The tension between him and Ebony's family was palpable, and it seemed to swell with every exchange. What had started as a simple request for quiet had turned into something far more complicated, and there was no telling how this confrontation would end. The plane continued its journey through the sky, but for Todd, it felt as if time had come to a standstill. The tension was unbearable, and the flight that should have been a moment of peace was now a battleground for his emotions. The tension had been building steadily, layer by layer, until it reached an unbearable crescendo. The cabin of the airplane, which had once felt like a confined space for casual travel, now felt like a pressure cooker, each second adding to the heat, the weight, the oppressive feeling that clung to every inch of space. Todd could feel the sweat pooling in the small of his back, a trickle of anxiety that he could no longer ignore. His chest constricted with each breath, and the hum of the engines seemed to blur, replaced by the pounding of his heartbeat. He was no longer able to just sit quietly, waiting for the confrontation to pass. The flight attendant had walked away, her fleeting attention not enough to settle the storm in Todd's mind. The cabin noise had quieted, and the chatter from the surrounding passengers was muffled, drowned out by the intensity of the scene unfolding in front of him. The moments of silence were sharp, cutting through the thick atmosphere like blades, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, caught in the midst of something he hadn't expected but couldn't avoid. Ebony's family was now watching him intently. Her children had long since stopped playing, their eyes wide with confusion. They didn't understand what had transpired. Their mother had been asked to lower her voice, and now everything had shifted, turning the playful energy into something more sinister, more uncomfortable. Ebony's husband, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, glared at Todd as if daring him to say another word, daring him to escalate this situation further. "Look," Todd finally said, his voice trembling, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I need a little peace. I don't want to get into some kind of argument with you, but I asked for quiet, and it feels like you're just ignoring it." Ebony's face tightened, the smooth veneer of politeness starting to crack. She had tried, at first, to keep her composure, but now, the mask of civility was beginning to slip. Her lips pressed together, and her eyes flashed with something deeper than surprise, anger, frustration, and confusion. Why had this man, this stranger, suddenly become so insistent on disturbing their journey? What right did he have to ruin their peaceful family moment? "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice rising now, sharp and biting. Her children were quiet, sensing the danger in the shift of their mother's tone, but their confusion was palpable. They didn't understand why things were turning ugly so quickly. "You're really going to make this about you?" she continued, her words cutting through the air. "What? Do you think you're the only one on this plane who matters?" Todd could feel the sting of her words, each syllable pricking at his already raw nerves. He had tried so hard to remain calm, to keep his emotions in check, but her anger now mirrored his own. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. His chest tightened, the pressure overwhelming him, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he might explode with all the pent-up frustration he had been holding onto for far too long. "I didn't ask for much," Todd shouted, his voice suddenly rising above the surrounding noise. The words spilled out before he could stop them, fueled by the frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface for what felt like hours. "Just a little bit of silence. That's all. But you couldn't even respect that. You think it's all about you, don't you? You're too wrapped up in your own world to even notice other people around you." The words hit Ebony like a slap to the face. She recoiled for a moment, her eyes flashing with a mix of disbelief and fury. How dare this man accuse her of being inconsiderate? How dare he speak to her this way? It was as if every layer of politeness that had built up in her had been peeled away, leaving raw emotion exposed. "You have no idea what it's like to have kids on a flight," she fired back, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what it's like to try and keep them entertained, to make them happy for a few hours while trapped in a metal box with strangers. You don't know the half of it, but instead of understanding, you think it's all about you. Todd could feel the heat rising in his face, his breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. The anger and frustration that had been building for so long were now pouring out, and he couldn't stop it. He had wanted peace, but in this moment, it felt as though peace was a distant dream, one that he couldn't even grasp. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding anymore. This had escalated into something far more personal. The eyes of the passengers, which had been glancing nervously between the two, were now fixed firmly on the scene unfolding in front of them. No one spoke, but it was clear that every person in the cabin was aware of what was happening. Some looked uncomfortable. Others were simply watching with wide eyes, as if witnessing a train wreck in slow motion. The tension was thick enough to feel in the air, a tangible presence that weighed heavily on everyone. Ebony stood up, her voice growing louder as her frustration mounted. "You're not the only one who's tired. Okay, we've been flying all day. We're exhausted too. And I don't need you judging me or my family like that." Todd's vision blurred for a moment, his mind spiraling as her words hit him. They were in the wrong, and he knew it. There was no denying that now. He had started this fight, and there was no way to take it back. The once peaceful flight had become a battleground, and all he had wanted was for things to calm down. "I didn't ask for this," Todd muttered, his voice shaking. His heart was pounding in his chest, his hands now trembling uncontrollably. He felt as though he were sinking into the floor of the plane, trapped by his own frustration. How had it gotten so bad so quickly? How had a simple request turned into a full-blown argument? The flight attendant returned, sensing the change in the dynamic, her face more concerned now than before. She approached cautiously, but this time, there was no gentle reassurance in her tone. "Is there a problem here?" she asked firmly, her eyes moving between Todd and Ebony. Ebony was the first to speak, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, there's a problem. This man," she pointed at Todd, her finger trembling with anger. "This man has been harassing me and my family for no reason. He has no right to tell us how to behave on this flight." The words stung, but Todd couldn't respond. His throat tightened, and his stomach turned with the weight of his guilt. Had it really come to this? Had he really pushed them this far? He wanted to apologize, but he couldn't. His pride, his anger, everything was in the way. The words lodged in his throat like a brick, and no matter how hard he tried to speak, they wouldn't come. The attendant's gaze flicked back to him, her expression hardening. "Sir," she said, her voice now carrying authority, "if there's a problem, we'll have to ask you to step off the plane." The words hit Todd like a cold splash of water. For a brief second, he froze, his mind unable to process the full implications. He couldn't be kicked off the plane. He couldn't lose control like this. His heart pounded, panic bubbling up inside him. But the reality was sinking in. This situation had reached its peak, and there was no way to stop it now. Todd began, but his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause this." But the apology felt empty, lost in the sea of rising emotions. The tension in the air was palpable, the conflict hanging there, unresolved. As the weight of the situation pressed down on Todd's chest, he could feel the eyes of the passengers on him. But at that moment, none of it mattered. The flight was no longer about the destination. It was no longer about the cramped seats or the long journey. It was only about this moment, a moment that had spiraled completely out of his control. The aftermath of the confrontation was still settling over the cabin, like a fog that hadn't quite lifted. The flight attendant, now standing between Todd and Ebony, sensed the gravity of the situation. Her earlier politeness was gone, replaced by a professional detachment that had the air of finality. She had seen countless disputes on flights before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about noise or a disagreement over space. It was about people, their emotions, their frustrations, and the fine line between civility and chaos that had been crossed in a single moment. Todd felt small under her gaze, a mixture of shame and embarrassment churning in his stomach. The words he had shouted, the way his frustration had spilled out, he couldn't take any of it back. It had all been too much. And in his attempt to gain a little peace, he had lost all sense of control. The confrontation had become an uncontrollable force, spiraling far beyond what he had ever intended. He had let himself get caught up in something that was never his to fix. And now, here he was, on the verge of losing more than just his temper. He was losing his sense of self. Ebony, on the other hand, was still standing with her arms crossed, her expression hard but her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. Her children, silent beside her, looked up at her with wide eyes, the confusion and worry reflected in their faces. The quiet tension that hung between the two families felt suffocating, the emotional residue of the conflict refusing to dissipate. It wasn't just about what had been said, it was about what had been left unsaid. The assumptions, the misunderstandings, the hurt that had surfaced in such a short amount of time. "Sir," the flight attendant finally spoke, her voice even but firm. "We need to resolve this. You can either apologize and try to de-escalate this, or I'll have to report the situation to the captain." The weight of her words hit Todd like a tidal wave. He had felt like he was drowning in his own emotions. And now, the situation was escalating in ways he had never anticipated. His mind raced as the moments dragged on, the seconds feeling like an eternity. He couldn't remember the last time he had been this exposed, this vulnerable, his emotions laid bare for everyone to witness. But in this moment, he realized something important. If he didn't take control of the situation, it would only spiral further out of his grasp. He took a deep breath, his chest tight, and for the first time since the conflict had begun, he looked around at the people in the cabin. The eyes of the passengers were all on him, some judgmental, some sympathetic, others simply curious. But they were all waiting for him to do something, to resolve this, to take responsibility. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he hesitated. But then, he found the words. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice rough but genuine. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. I've been on edge, and I let my frustration get the best of me. That wasn't right. I shouldn't have yelled, and I shouldn't have made you feel like that. I'm really sorry. Ebony, I know you're just trying to be with your family, and I didn't respect that." The silence that followed felt heavy, like the tension had settled back into the corners of the cabin, awaiting resolution. Ebony's eyes softened just slightly, the hard edges of her anger beginning to smooth over. She had been holding on to her own frustration, her own hurt, and Todd's words, though simple, had struck a chord. Ebony sighed, rubbing her forehead as if trying to erase the fatigue from the situation. The children beside her shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in the atmosphere, unsure whether they were supposed to respond or remain quiet. The tension that had hung in the air seemed to dissipate, if only just a little. "I didn't mean to snap either," Ebony replied, her voice calm but tired. "This whole thing, it's just been a long day, and I've been trying to keep it together for them." She nodded to her children, her voice softer now, the anger fading into resignation. "I'm sorry too. I let my frustration get in the way. We're both tired, and that's no excuse for what happened. Let's just let it go." Todd felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly as Ebony spoke. Her apology, though brief, was genuine, and it reminded him that everyone had their breaking point. The flight had been a microcosm of life itself, full of unexpected stress, misunderstandings, and moments of human weakness. But there was also room for understanding, for forgiveness, and for realizing that sometimes the best way to heal a situation was to acknowledge the hurt and move forward. The flight attendant, sensing the change in the mood, offered a small nod of approval, though her professional demeanor never faltered. She looked around at the passengers, then back at the two families, her eyes softening as the tension in the air gradually lifted. "Thank you both for resolving this," she said, her voice warm but still authoritative. "I know flying can be stressful, and sometimes things can get heated, but we all have to remember that we're sharing this space together. Let's all take a moment to breathe and relax." "Okay." Todd nodded, finally feeling the weight of the situation lift, if only slightly. His shoulders relaxed, the tightness in his chest beginning to ease. He wasn't proud of how things had escalated, but he had learned something important in the process, that sometimes the most difficult part of resolving conflict was simply admitting when you were wrong. and finding the humility to apologize. Ebony, too, seemed to relax, her posture less tense now, though the momentary strain was still visible in the way she carried herself. Her children, sensing the shift, returned to their toys, the brief moment of tension now fading into the background. The flight attendant, satisfied with the resolution, walked back down the aisle, her presence no longer needed as the cabin returned to its normal rhythm. As Todd sat back in his seat, he looked out the window, the clouds below him a reminder of how small and insignificant his frustrations had seemed in the grand scheme of things. The flight, once filled with anxiety, now felt more manageable. He wasn't at peace yet. There was still a lot of tension left in the world, but he had learned something valuable in that brief, intense moment. That conflict, when handled with humility and understanding, could lead to a resolution, a lesson in letting go of anger and embracing the calm that followed. The rest of the flight passed without incident. People returned to their conversations, the hum of the airplane's engines now a gentle backdrop to the quietude that had returned to the cabin. Todd leaned back in his seat, the sound of the engines and the gentle rocking of the plane lulling him into a state of peace, knowing that the conflict had been resolved, and he had emerged from it a little wiser than before.